She became a prisoner in a German swamp. For 32 years, Sophia Dorothea was buried alive by her own husband. Her crime? Falling in love with a man who wasn't the king. The punishment? A lover murdered and dissolved in quicklime under the palace floorboards, and a wife erased from the face of the earth. History remembers King George I as the founder of a dynasty, but the hidden truth is that his throne was built on the bones of a murder victim and the silence of a stolen queen. This is not a royal romance. It is a crime scene investigation into the love affair that the British monarchy tried to hide for 300 years. In the world of 17th century German principalities, marriage was never about romance. It was about real estate. It was about merging borders, consolidating armies, and hoarding gold. Sophia Dorothea was born in 1666 into the House of Brunswick-Lüneburg. Her father, George William, was the Duke of Celle. Her mother, Eleanor, was a French Huguenot lady of lower nobility. This detail, her mother's lower status, is the first clue in our investigation. Because of her mother's common blood, Sophia was initially looked down upon by the snobbish German aristocracy. They called her a bastard behind their fans. But Sophia had something that silenced the critics: money, immense, staggering amounts of money. As the only surviving child of her father, she stood to inherit vast territories and a fortune that could bankroll empires. In the grand casino of European politics, Sophia Dorothea was the ultimate poker chip. She was a walking territory. Whoever married her would control Celle. And looking across the border with hungry, predatory eyes was the House of Hanover. The House of Hanover was ambitious. They were playing a long game. Their goal was nothing less than the throne of England. To achieve this, they needed to consolidate their power in Germany. They needed Celle. The matriarch of Hanover, Electress Sophia, looked at Sophia Dorothea and saw a problem. She despised Sophia's mother. She despised Sophia's impure blood. But she loved Sophia's money. The decision was made in a cold stone room by men looking at maps. They decided to marry Sophia Dorothea to her first cousin, George Louis of Hanover. It was a merger of corporations, not a union of souls. They didn't care that the two cousins had nothing in common. They didn't care that they hated each other. The contract was signed. The price was agreed upon. The bride was sold. If we look for the fatal weakness in this story, we see it early on. Sophia Dorothea was a creature of emotion. She was raised with French sensibilities, lively, passionate, expressive. She believed in feelings. In the rigid, militaristic culture of northern Germany, this was a dangerous defect. When the news of her engagement to George Louis was broken to her, Sophia was just 16 years old. A normal aristocratic girl would have bowed her head and accepted her duty. Sophia did not. We have a vivid visual account of this moment, a scene that foreshadows the violence to come. Her father presented her with a miniature portrait of George Louis, encased in diamonds, a traditional betrothal gift. Sophia Dorothea took the portrait, looked at the heavy-lidded, cynical eyes of her future husband, and threw it against the wall with all her strength. The diamonds shattered. The painting cracked. She screamed that she would not marry that pig snout. This outburst tells us everything we need to know. She had a spirit that refused to be tamed, but it also tells us she was naive. She thought her anger mattered. She thought her no had power. She didn't realize that in the eyes of her father and her future in-laws, she was not a person with a voice. She was an asset to be transferred. She fainted into her mother's arms, but when she woke up, the wedding was still on. The machinery of the state did not stop for a teenage girl's tears. On November 22, 1682, the wedding took place in the chapel of Celle Castle. It was a funeral for her happiness. The groom, George Louis, stood at the altar, looking bored and resentful. He was 22 years old, a soldier, a man of few words, and even fewer sentiments. He was short, physically unappealing to Sophia, and known for his boorish behavior. He didn't want a wife. He wanted the territory she brought with her. He felt that marrying this half-commoner cousin was beneath his dignity, a sacrifice he was making for the family. The moment the vows were spoken, Sophia Dorothea was transported from her loving home in Celle to the Lehne-Schloss Palace in Hanover. If Celle was a warm nest, Hanover was a snake pit. The villain of this chapter enters the stage here. The mother-in-law, Electress Sophia. Electress Sophia is one of the most intellectual women of her age, but she had a heart of granite. She made no secret of her disdain for her new daughter-in-law. She wrote letters mocking Sophia Dorothea, calling her stupid, vain, and ill-bred. Imagine the psychological torture of Sophia's daily life. She is 16. She's in a foreign court. Her husband ignores her. Her mother-in-law mocks her. The courtiers, sensing the power dynamic, isolate her. She is surrounded by gold and silk, but she is essentially in solitary confinement. She learned very quickly that in Hanover, kindness was a weakness, and she was the weakest person in the room. Despite the mutual loathing, there was one job Sophia had to do: produce heirs. The survival of the dynasty depended on it. In this aspect, Sophia Dorothea was a professional. In 1683, she gave birth to a son, George Augustus. In 1687, she gave birth to a daughter, Sophia Dorothea. She had provided an heir and a spare. She had secured the succession. In any normal contract, her work would be done, and she would be entitled to some respect. But George Louis did not give her respect. He gave her humiliation. Once the children were born, George Louis abandoned even the pretense of being a husband. He moved his mistress directly into the palace. The mistress was Melusine von der Schulenburg. The visual contradiction here is staggering, almost comical if it weren't so cruel. Sophia Dorothea was widely considered one of the most beautiful women in Germany. Dark hair, flashing eyes, a figure that turned heads. Melusine was famously plain. She was extremely tall and extremely thin. The courtiers, cruel as they were, nicknamed her the Maypole. Why did George prefer the Maypole to the beauty? Because Melusine was safe. She was intellectually undemanding. She was docile. She didn't challenge him. She didn't ask for passion. Sophia Dorothea, with her French temper and her pleading eyes, exhausted him. He wanted a slipper, not a firework. The insult was public. George would walk into court balls with Melusine on his arm, leaving Sophia Dorothea to walk behind them. He would sit with Melusine at the opera. He lavished Melusine with the money that technically belonged to Sophia's inheritance. This is where the tragedy shifts from political to personal. It is one thing to be in a loveless marriage. It is another to be publicly erased while you are still standing there. Sophia was being told every single day that she was worthless as a woman. She was merely a womb that had served its purpose and could now be discarded. We must also look at the relationship between Sophia and her children, particularly her son, George Augustus. The Hanoverian court operated on a system of rigid separation. The children were property of the state, not the mother. Electress Sophia, the grandmother, took over their upbringing. She viewed Sophia Dorothea as a bad influence. "We cannot have the boy infected with her French frivolity," was the prevailing sentiment. Sophia Dorothea was pushed to the margins of the nursery. She adored her children. They were the only things in Hanover that belonged to her. But she saw them turning into Hanoverians. She saw them being molded by the very people who hated her. This is a critical psychological blow. It stripped her of her primary identity. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a ruler. And now she was barely a mother. She was a ghost haunting the corridors of her own home. By the late 1680s, Sophia Dorothea was in a state of profound depression. She was in her early 20s. She was trapped. Her parents told her to bear it for the sake of politics. Her husband wished she would disappear. She was a woman standing on the edge of a cliff looking for a hand to hold. Any hand. And as fate would have it, a hand appeared. A hand attached to a sword, holding a rose and dripping with danger. Enter Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck. If George Louis was the villain of a grim German fairy tale, Königsmarck was the hero of a French romance novel. He was Swedish. He was rich. He was incredibly handsome. He was a soldier of fortune who had fought across Europe, leaving a trail of broken hearts in every capital from Paris to Stockholm. He was the bad boy of the 17th century, charismatic, reckless, and utterly devoid of fear. Königsmarck arrived in Hanover in 1688 to take a commission in the Hanoverian army. But this wasn't a meeting of strangers. Here is the detective detail that adds a layer of destiny to the tragedy. Sophia and Königsmarck had known each other as children. They had played together in the gardens of Celle when life was innocent. When they saw each other again in the suffocating atmosphere of the Hanoverian court, the recognition was instant. To Sophia, Königsmarck wasn't just a handsome man. He was a time machine. He represented her lost childhood. He represented the days before she was sold. He represented home. To Königsmarck, Sophia was a damsel in distress, and he was a man who couldn't resist saving a damsel. The contrast was intoxicating. George Louis smelled of stale beer and horses. Königsmarck smelled of French perfume and gunpowder. George Louis grunted. Königsmarck recited poetry. It began innocently enough, a look across a crowded room, a conversation about the old days in Celle, a shared laugh at the absurdity of the rigid court etiquette. But in a totalitarian regime like the Hanoverian court, laughter is a revolutionary act. The stage was set for an affair, but every tragedy needs a catalyst, a specific agent of chaos. That agent was Countess Clara Elizabeth von Platen. Countess Platen was the mistress of Sophia's father-in-law, the Elector Ernst August. She was the most powerful woman in Hanover after the Electress. She was older, manipulative, and voraciously sexual. And she wanted Königsmarck. When the dashing Swedish count arrived, Countess Platen decided he would be her new toy. She pursued him aggressively. Königsmarck, however, made a fatal mistake. He rejected the most powerful woman in the court because he was falling in love with the most powerless one. This rejection created a monster. Countess Platen didn't just get angry, she got vindictive. She began to watch Königsmarck like a hawk. She realized his eyes were wandering toward the neglected Princess Sophia. Platen realized that if she couldn't have him, she could use him to destroy the woman she despised. The atmosphere in the Linischloss Palace became a pressure cooker. Spies were everywhere. Servants were bribed. Letters were intercepted. Sophia Dorothea, blinded by her need for affection, didn't see the trap closing around her. She thought her love was a secret sanctuary. She didn't realize she was living in a glass house and the people outside were holding stones. Why did she do it? Why risk her life, her reputation, and her children for a man like Königsmarck? Historians often dismiss her as foolish or reckless, but the philosophy of the human condition tells us something different. The human soul cannot survive without connection. If you starve a person of food, they die. If you starve a person of love, they go mad or they rebel. Sophia's infidelity was not an act of lust. It was an act of survival. It was a scream. It was her way of saying, I exist. I feel. I am alive. She looked at her golden cage and decided that she would rather die flying than live sitting on the perch. She began to meet Königsmark in secret. She began to write to him, and in doing so, she handed her enemies the weapon they needed to execute her. The ink on the first love letter was the first drop of blood in this tragedy. The pawn had decided to move off her square, and the king was getting ready to strike her down. In the dusty archives of the University of Lund in Sweden, there sits a collection of papers that should have been burned 300 years ago. They are fragile, yellowing, and covered in the frantic, looping handwriting of two people who were writing for their lives. These are the Königsmark letters. There are over 300 of them. Each one is a piece of evidence in a capital crime. Each one is a smoking gun. History usually erases the whispers of lovers. We know who fought whom and who signed which treaty, but we rarely know what was whispered in the dark corners of a palace corridor at 2 a.m. But in the case of Sophia Dorothea and Count Königsmark, we know everything. It is the story of how a neglected wife and an arrogant soldier decided to set fire to the House of Hanover, believing that the flames would warm them, never realizing that the fire would simply consume them alive. To understand how the catastrophe unfolded, we must first look at the timeline. The affair did not begin with a bang, it began with a conversation. By 1690, Sophia Dorothea was practically a widow in her own marriage. George Louis, her husband, was spending his nights with his mistress, Melusine, or away on military campaigns. Sophia was left alone in the vast echoing chambers of the Schloss Palace. She was 24 years old, starving for affection, and bored out of her mind. Philip Christoph von Königsmark was the antidote to boredom. He was a man of the world, a soldier who had seen the glittering courts of France and the battlefields of the Ottoman Empire. When he spoke to Sophia, he didn't speak to her as a breeding mare for the Hanoverian state. He spoke to her as a woman. He noticed her dress. He noticed her wit. He noticed her sadness. The transition from friendship to lovers happened around 1691 or 1692. It began with the classic detective signs, the lingering touches, the glances that lasted a second too long, the sudden desire to take walks in the garden at the same time. The court of Hanover was a small incestuous place. Everyone watched. Privacy was a luxury that royalty could not afford. And yet, they managed it. They met in the apartments of Sophia's mother, the Duchess of Celle, who was visiting and sympathetic to her daughter's plight. They met in the shadows of the garden trellises. They met in Sophia's own bedroom, guided there by the only ally they had. The risks they took were astronomical. If caught, Sophia faced ruin. Königsmark faced the executioner's axe, but the danger acted as an accelerant. The fear of being caught made the passion more intense. It was the adrenaline of the battlefield transferred to the bedroom. No royal affair can exist without a third wheel, a gatekeeper who holds the keys. In this story, that tragic figure is Eleanor von Niesebeck. She was Sophia Dorothea's lady-in-waiting and her closest friend. Fräulein Niesebeck is the unsung hero, or perhaps the unsung victim of this drama. She was the one who stood guard at the door while the lovers were inside. She was the one who carried the letters hidden in her bodice. She was the one who facilitated the impossible. From a psychological perspective, we must ask why Knesebeck did it. She was risking her own life. Perhaps she was a romantic who believed in Sophia's right to happiness. Or perhaps she was caught in the gravity well of Sophia's desperation. Sophia clung to Knesebeck. She begged her. She cried to her. Knesebeck became the container for Sophia's overflowing emotions. The presence of Knesebeck allowed the affair to flourish. It gave the lovers a false sense of security. They thought that because they had a lookout, they were invisible. They forgot that in a palace, the walls have ears and the floorboards have eyes. They forgot that for every loyal Kniesebeck, there were 10 spies paid by Countess Platen. Now, let us turn to the letters. The survival of this correspondence is a miracle of history. Usually, when a scandal breaks, the first thing people do is burn the letters. But Königsmarck was sentimental, and perhaps a bit arrogant. He kept them. And Sophia, desperate to hold on to a piece of him when he was away on campaign, kept his. Reading them today is a voyeuristic experience. They are not the polished, poetic letters of fiction. They are messy, raw, and full of anxiety. Königsmarck's letters reveal his fatal weakness, possessiveness and jealousy. He was not a calm lover. He was paranoid. He would write furious letters accusing Sophia of looking at other men, of smiling at her husband, of not loving him enough. "I slept like a dog," he wrote in one letter, complaining about being away from her. "I am in despair. If you do not love me, I shall die." Sophia's letters are different. They are the letters of a woman drowning. She writes of her terror of her husband. She writes of her loneliness. "I spend my days in weeping," she wrote. "Come to me. You are my only consolation." They use ciphers and code names. George Louis was often referred to as the Petit Monsieur or other derogatory nicknames. They wrote in French, the language of courtly love, but the emotions were primal. These letters serve as the forensic evidence of their mindset. They were not just having a sexual affair, they were building an alternative reality. In their letters, they were husband and wife. They swore oaths of fidelity written in their own blood. They created a world where George Louis didn't exist, where Hanover didn't exist, where only Léonice and Tircis existed. This dissociation from reality is dangerous. It blinds you to the axe hanging over your head. While the lovers were writing fantasies in ink, Countess Platen was writing tragedy in real life. The mistress of the Elector had not forgiven Königsmarck for rejecting her. Her hatred had calcified into a cold, hard determination to destroy him. Platen was the detective of the prosecution. She gathered intelligence. She noticed that Königsmarck's lights were on late at night. She noticed Sophia's flushed cheeks. She bribed servants to report on their movements. There is a famous, perhaps apocryphal story about the glove incident. It is said that Platen arranged for a glove of Sophia's to be found in a compromising place or vice versa to stir up suspicion. Whether true or not, it illustrates the atmosphere. Platen was manufacturing a scandal, but she had a problem. George Louis, the cuckolded husband, didn't seem to care. This is the drama-filled contradiction of the Hanoverian court. George Louis didn't love his wife. He didn't want her. In a normal world, he might have been relieved that someone else was keeping her occupied. But this wasn't a normal world. It was a matter of dynastic honor. George Louis didn't care about Sophia's heart, but he cared about his reputation. He couldn't be the laughingstock of Europe. Platen knew this. She knew she had to make the affair public enough that George would be forced to act. She had to turn a private sin into a public humiliation. Königsmarck made Platen's job very easy. His fatal flaw wasn't just jealousy, it was hubris. He was a man who thought he was untouchable. He was a count, a general, a wealthy aristocrat. He didn't believe a little German court could hurt him. When he traveled to other courts, specifically the hedonistic court of Dresden in Saxony, he drank. And when he drank, he talked. He bragged about his conquest. He hinted that he had captured the heart of the future, Queen of England. Rumors fly faster than birds. The whispers from Dresden drifted back to Hanover. Have you heard what Königsmarck is saying about the princess? Imagine the sheer stupidity of this. He was sleeping with the wife of a man who commanded an army and had the power of life and death, and he was gossiping about it in bars. This recklessness terrified Sophia. She begged him to be discreet, but Königsmarck was addicted to the drama. He loved being the hero of the story. He didn't realize he was actually the victim in a horror movie who walks into the dark basement alone. By 1694, the situation had become unsustainable. The elector was angry. The electress was venomous. George Louis was coldly furious. Sophia Dorothea was being treated like a pariah. The verbal abuse from George Louis escalated. There were reports of physical altercations, him grabbing her, shaking her, throwing her out of rooms. Sophia realized she was in physical danger. She looked at her life and saw only two options: stay and die a slow death of the soul, or run and risk a quick death of the body. She chose to run. The lovers began to plot their escape. This was the grand plan. They would flee Hanover. They would go to Wolfenbüttel, a neighboring duchy ruled by a sympathetic relative, and from there Sophia would sue for divorce. They would live happily ever after on Königsmarck's estates. It was a plan born of desperation and naivety. It ignored the political reality. No German duke would protect a runaway wife against the powerful House of Hanover, especially not when Hanover was on the verge of becoming British royalty. They were planning a fairy tale ending in a Game of Thrones world. The timeline narrows down to a single fateful night, July 1st, 1694. Königsmarck had just returned to Hanover from Saxony. He had secured a commission in the Saxon army. He was ready. This was supposed to be the final goodbye before the escape. He entered the Leineschloss Palace late at night. He went to Sophia's chambers. They spent the night together. They talked about the future. They looked at maps. They reaffirmed their love. It was a night of high emotion. Sophia was terrified, but hopeful. Königsmarck was confident. According to the historical reconstruction, he stayed late, too late. As the dawn approached, he kissed her goodbye. "Tomorrow," they likely said, "tomorrow we will be free." He stepped out of her room. He walked down the corridor. And Sophia Dorothea never saw him again. The affair between Sophia and Königsmarck was doomed not because they were caught, but because of who they were. They were characters from two different genres trying to be in the same play. Sophia was in a tragedy, a woman trapped by societal structures she couldn't break. Königsmarck was in an adventure, a man who thought he could fight his way out of anything. But in the end, the system always wins against the individual. The House of Hanover was a machine. It didn't care about love. It didn't care about passion. It only cared about order. And Sophia and Königsmarck were agents of disorder. The letters they wrote, which they thought were testaments to their love, became the warrant for their destruction. They thought they were writing a romance, but the Hanoverian archivists were reading a confession. The flame had burned too bright. It had consumed all the oxygen in the room, and now the darkness was rushing in to fill the void. The lover is gone, the husband is awake, and the castle is locking its doors. In the genre of locked room mysteries, usually a body is found in a sealed room, and the detective must figure out how the killer got in. But in the case of Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck, history presents us with the opposite puzzle. A man walked into a palace. He was famous, he was armed, and he was physically strong. He walked down a corridor, turned a corner, and vanished from the face of the earth. He didn't just die, he evaporated. For 300 years, historians, treasure hunters, and construction workers have looked for his bones. This is the story of the night of July 1st, 1694. It is the darkest night in the history of the House of Hanover. It is the night when the future King of England became, indirectly or directly, a murderer. We are about to reconstruct the assassination that turned a reckless lover into a ghost under the floorboards. To catch a wolf like Königsmarck, you don't chase him, you bait him. The master architect of this assassination was almost certainly Countess Platen, the spurned mistress of the Elector. She was the Lady Macbeth of Hanover. She had the motive and the means. The detective theory suggests that on that humid July night, Platen laid a trap. Some historical accounts suggest she forged a note. Imagine Königsmarck receiving a slip of paper, seemingly in Sophia Dorothea's handwriting. "Come to me tonight. It is urgent." He wouldn't hesitate. He was a man driven by passion, not caution. But even if there was no forged note, Platen knew his routine. She knew he was visiting the princess. She went to the Elector, Ernst August. She told him essentially, "The Swede is in the princess's bedroom right now. He is cuckolding your son and planning to steal your daughter-in-law. If you don't stop him, the honor of Hanover is ruined." The Elector was an old man, pragmatic and ruthless. He didn't care about love, but he cared about his property. Sophia Dorothea was his property. He gave the order, not necessarily to kill, perhaps just to arrest. But when you send armed men to confront an armed soldier in the dark, you are signing a death warrant. Platen recruited 4 courtiers, swordsmen loyal to her. They were positioned in the Hall of Knights of the Schloss Palace. They hid in the shadows of the vast, terrifying chimney piece. They waited. The candle wax dripped. The clock ticked. Königsmarck left Sophia Dorothea's chambers in the early hours of the morning. Let's visualize this moment. He is flushed with love. He is humming a tune. He believes he has just finalized the plans for their great escape. He thinks he is walking toward freedom. He steps out of her wings of the palace. He enters the Hall of Knights. It is a large, echoing space. The moonlight cuts through the high windows. He is alone, or so he thinks. As he passes the great chimney, the shadows move. 4 men step out. Königsmarck was a veteran soldier. His reaction would have been instantaneous. His hand went to his sword. But a sword is useless in a hallway ambush against 4 opponents. The struggle was short, brutal, and chaotic. This wasn't a duel of honor. It was a butchery. Swords clashed, daggers were drawn. Königsmarck fought back. He was a strong man, but he was overwhelmed. He was struck down. The fatal blow likely severed an artery or pierced his lung. He fell to the stone floor of the palace that would one day belong to the King of England. Legend and some court records from the time say that Countess Platen couldn't resist watching. She was either hiding nearby or rushed in as soon as he fell. Imagine the scene, the handsome count, bleeding out on the cold stones, looking up at the woman who had orchestrated his death. He knew. In those final seconds, he knew exactly who had killed him. It is said that with his dying breath, he cursed her. "You may kill me, but you will never have me." Or perhaps he whispered Sophia's name. Save the princess. Platen, in a moment of grotesque cruelty, is said to have stepped on his face with her heel, effectively silencing him forever. Whether this detail is true or a dramatic embellishment, the outcome was the same. Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck was dead. The silence returned to the Hall of Knights, but now they had a problem. They had a corpse, and not just any corpse, the corpse of a foreign dignitary, a major general in the Saxon army, a man with powerful friends. They couldn't just call the coroner. This had to be a disappearance, not a murder. What do you do with a body in a palace at 3 a.m.? You cannot carry it out the front door. The guards would see. You cannot throw it out the window. You have to make it part of the building. The most persistent and credible historical theory is that they lifted the floorboards of the Hall of Knights. They dug a hole in the earth foundation beneath the palace. They stripped the body of its fine clothes and jewelry. They dumped the body into the hole. And then, the crucial detail, quicklime. They covered him in caustic lime to speed up decomposition and destroy the smell. They nailed the floorboards back down. They scrubbed the blood from the stones. By the time the sun rose over Hanover on July 2nd, 1694, the Hall of Knights looked exactly as it had the day before. Servants walked over it, courtiers walked over it, George Louis walked over it. They were literally walking on the bones of the man who tried to steal the queen. It is the ultimate Gothic horror image, the skeleton of the lover lying beneath the feet of the husband. While the body was being buried, the second phase of the operation began, the erasure of identity. Countess Platen and her agents rushed to Königsmarck's private lodgings in the city. They needed to find the letters. If the letters were found by the public, the scandal would destroy the House of Hanover. It would prove that the future Queen of England was an adulteress. It would bastardize her children. They ransacked his rooms. They found the bundles of letters from Sophia Dorothea. Most were seized to be used as blackmail/evidence in the upcoming divorce. But anything else, his personal effects, his diaries, was destroyed or hidden. They were systematically deleting a human being from existence. Now let us return to Sophia Dorothea. She is in her room packing her bags. She is waiting for Königsmarck. Morning comes, noon comes. No word. She sends her faithful lady-in-waiting, Fräulein Knesebeck, to inquire. Knesebeck comes back with a pale face. His apartments are empty. His servants are gone. The palace guards are doubling their watch. Sophia Dorothea began to panic. She went to the windows. She looked for him. She didn't know he was already dead. She thought perhaps he had been arrested, or perhaps he had fled without her. But then the atmosphere in the palace shifted. The doors to her wing were locked from the outside. Guards were posted at her entrance. She was no longer a princess waiting for her lover. She was a prisoner waiting for her sentence. The cruelty of the Hanoverian court was that they never told her. They never officially informed her that Königsmarck was dead. For weeks, maybe months, she lived in an agony of uncertainty. Did he leave me? Is he in a dungeon? Is he dead? They let her torture herself with hope. It wasn't until much later, when she saw the cold, triumphant look in Countess Platen's eyes, that she realized the truth. He wasn't coming back. The disappearance of Count Königsmarck became an international sensation. His sister, the famous beauty Aurora von Königsmarck, refused to believe he had just vanished. She traveled to Hanover. She demanded to see the elector. She demanded an investigation. She threatened to go to the emperor in Vienna. She threatened to go to the king of France. "Where is my brother?" she screamed at the gates of the Lena Schloss. The Hanoverian officials shrugged. "We do not know. He likely ran off on an adventure. He was a wild man." They lied to her face. They lied to the diplomats. They lied to history. The cover-up was absolute. The House of Hanover closed ranks. To admit the murder would be to admit the adultery. So they stuck to the story of the missing count. Aurora spent her fortune and her life trying to find the truth, but she hit a wall of silence. But the detective in us knows that secrets are hard to keep forever. In 2016, during renovations of the Lena Schloss, construction workers found human bones deep under the floor levels. Forensic analysis was conducted. Were these the bones of Königsmarck? The DNA test compared them to living relatives of the Königsmarck family. The results were inconclusive, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Who else would be buried under the floor of a royal palace in a hasty grave covered in lime? It is almost certainly him. The ghost was real. The assassination of Königsmarck was not just a physical killing, it was an act of total domination. The House of Hanover decided that an individual, a vibrant, living man, was an inconvenience to the state, so they turned him into masonry. They reduced a human being to a structural problem in the foundation of their power. This act defined the future of the British monarchy. George Louis became king with blood on his hands. He sat on the throne of England knowing that his wife's lover was rotting under his floor back in Germany. It created a legacy of paranoia. The Hanoverians became obsessed with secrecy, with controlling their women, with crushing scandal before it could breathe. They learned that violence works as long as you hide the body well enough. Sophia Dorothea didn't just lose a lover, she lost her connection to reality. If a man like Königsmarck could vanish, then she could vanish too. And she was right. The murder of the lover was just the prologue to the burial of the wife. He was buried in lime. She would be buried in time. In the history of law, trials are usually public spectacles. They are about exposing the truth. But in 1694, in the Kingdom of Hanover, a trial took place that was designed to do the exact opposite, to bury the truth forever. Sophia Dorothea, the wife of the future King of England, stood accused. But the court faced a terrifying paradox. If they convicted her of adultery, they would bastardize her children and lose her massive dowry. If they found her innocent, she would remain free to embarrass the king. So the lawyers of Hanover invented a new kind of justice, a silent trial, a courtroom where the real crime, the affair with the murdered Count Königsmarck, was never mentioned, not once. Instead, they charged her with a crime that sounds almost bureaucratic: malicious desertion. This is the story of how a legal system was weaponized to erase a woman. It is the story of a divorce where the husband got everything: the money, the children, the crown, and the wife got a life sentence in a stone box. The days following the disappearance of Count Königsmarck were a psychological siege for Sophia Dorothea. She was confined to her apartments in the Lena Schloss. The guards at her door were no longer ceremonial. They were jailers. She still didn't know for certain that Königsmarck was dead, but the silence of the palace told her everything. The elector refused to see her. Her husband, George Louis, had already left for Berlin, distancing himself from the dirty work. He left the destruction of his wife to his father and his ministers. Sophia's state of mind was frantic. She realized she was trapped in a hostile country. Her only hope was her father, the Duke of Celle. Surely her own father would not let them imprison her. She wrote desperate letters to Celle. "They are treating me like a criminal," she wrote. "Save me." But here is the tragedy. Her father, the Duke, had been turned against her. The Hanoverians had sent him the Königsmarck letters. When her father read the passionate, explicit letters his daughter had written to the Swede, he was horrified. He was a man of his time, obsessed with honor. He felt his daughter had disgraced him. He washed his hands of her. He wrote back, telling her to submit to her husband. The door to home slammed shut. Sophia Dorothea was now an orphan with living parents. Now, the detective aspect shifts to the lawyers. The Hanoverian Privy Council faced a nightmare. They wanted to get rid of Sophia Dorothea. George Louis hated her and wanted a divorce, but a royal divorce in the 17th century was incredibly dangerous. Problem one: if they divorced her for adultery, the church would grant the separation, but it would cast doubt on the legitimacy of her son, George Augustus. If the boy was suspected of being Königsmarck's son, the House of Hanover would lose its claim to the British throne. That was unacceptable. Problem two: if they divorced her, she might demand the return of her dowry. Sophia brought immense wealth and territory to the marriage. Hanover needed that money. They couldn't afford to let her walk away with it. Problem three: if she was free, she might remarry. A remarried Sophia Dorothea, with her secrets and her claim to the title, would be a loose cannon in Europe. So they needed a solution that accomplished three things: ended the marriage, kept the money and the children, kept Sophia locked up so she couldn't remarry or talk. They found the solution in a legal loophole: malicious desertion. They would argue that Sophia Dorothea had refused to sleep with her husband. They would argue she had tried to run away. They would essentially divorce her for being a bad wife, not an adulterous wife. This allowed them to ignore Königsmarck completely. The dead body under the floorboards didn't need to be exhumed if the trial wasn't about him. A special tribunal was set up. It was not a court of law. It was a court of men paid by her husband. Sophia Dorothea was interrogated. This scene is a masterpiece of drama-filled contradictions. The investigators tried to bully her. They wanted her to confess to the affair privately, but deny it publicly. But Sophia Dorothea, broken as she was, found a sudden, defiant strength. She looked at the ministers and said, "I will not return to him. I will never live with him again." She realized that the marriage was her prison. If she agreed to reconcile, she would have to sleep in the same bed as the man who likely murdered her lover. That was a torture she could not endure, so she gave them what they wanted, but on her terms. She confessed to desertion. "Yes, I refuse to be his wife. Yes, I want to leave." She thought that by confessing to desertion, she would be granted a divorce and allowed to live in retirement at her father's court. She was naive. She didn't realize that desertion in royal law was a crime that stripped a woman of her rights. She thought she was signing her liberation papers. In reality, she was signing her own commitment order. There is one moment in the proceedings that is particularly chilling. To ensure that the adultery charge was truly buried, the church demanded a spiritual guarantee. They asked Sophia Dorothea to take Holy Communion and swear on the body of Christ that she had not committed adultery. This was a trap. If she swore and lied, she believed she would go to hell. If she refused to swear, she admitted guilt. Sophia Dorothea stood before the altar. The priest held out the host. The court held its breath. We do not know exactly what went through her mind. Did she consider her relationship with Königsmarck a marriage of souls and therefore not adultery in the eyes of God? Or did she simply lie to save her children? Some records suggest she took the sacrament. Others say she skirted the issue. But the result was the same. The official record stated that she was innocent of adultery, but guilty of refusing her conjugal duties. The irony is suffocating. The woman who loved too much was condemned for not loving enough. On December 28, 1694, the gavel fell, not just ending a marriage, but effectively ending a life. The divorce decree was a master class in vindictiveness. It branded Sophia Dorothea as the sole guilty party, stripping her of her title, her fortune, and, cruelest of all, her children, whom she was forbidden from ever seeing again. While George Louis walked away a free man, able to remarry and retain all power, Sophia was handed a sentence disguised as a residence. She was banished to the castle of Ahlden, held at the pleasure of the elector. It was a polite legal phrase for a brutal reality: life imprisonment without parole, where her jailer was the very man she had once called husband. In February 1695, the carriages arrived at the Lena Schloss to take her away. She was 28 years old. She said goodbye to her life. She was not allowed to say goodbye to her son, George, or her daughter, Sophia. Imagine the vivid visuals of that departure. A cold, gray German winter, the carriage wheels crunching on the snow. She looked back at the palace where she had arrived as a teenage bride. She left behind her jewelry, her clothes, her children, and the corpse of her lover under the floor. She took with her nothing but her grief. The journey to Ahlden Castle was a journey into the middle of nowhere. Ahlden was not a romantic fortress. It was a grim, moated manor house on the Lüneburg Heath. It was surrounded by swamps and flat, desolate land. It was a place designed for forgetting. When the carriage crossed the drawbridge and the heavy gates closed behind her, the silence descended. It was a silence that would last for 32 years. How did Europe react to this? Did the other kings and queens protest? Did the Pope intervene? No. There was a collective shrug. The House of Hanover had managed the PR campaign perfectly. They painted Sophia Dorothea as a hysterical, unstable woman who needed rest and seclusion for her own health. They effectively gaslighted the entire continent. People whispered about Königsmarck, of course, but without a body it was just a rumor. And George Louis was powerful. He was the elector designate. He was the heir to England. No one wanted to offend the future king over a disgraced wife. The only person who fought for her was Königsmarck's sister, Aurora. She screamed about murder. She screamed about the sham trial. But she was dismissed as a grieving, hysterical woman. The patriarchy closed ranks. The silent trial had worked. The truth was sealed in the files, and the woman was sealed in the castle. We like to think of law as a shield that protects the weak. But in the case of Sophia Dorothea, the law was a sword used by the strong. The trial wasn't about justice. It was about management. It was a bureaucratic exercise in disposing of a human being who had become inconvenient. They didn't kill her. That would have been too messy, too medieval. Instead, they used the civilized tools of the courtroom to execute her socially. They stripped her of her name. They stripped her of her role as a mother. They stripped her of her future. Sophia Dorothea walked into that courtroom a woman who had made a mistake. She walked out a non-person. The silent trial proves that you don't need a guillotine to destroy a life. A piece of paper with a seal on it works just as well. There's a specific form of torture that does not involve racks, thumbscrews, or burning iron. It is the torture of the calendar. It is the slow, dripping accumulation of days that turn into weeks, weeks that turn into years, and years that turn into decades, with absolutely nothing changing. In 1695, Sophia Dorothea entered the castle of Alden as a vibrant woman of 28. She would not leave it until she was a corpse of 60. This chapter is the study of that middle time. History often skips over imprisonment. We hear about the crime, the trial, and then the death. But the tragedy lies in the gap, the 32 years of breathing, eating, and sleeping in a void. We are going to enter the castle of shadows. We are going to walk the ramparts where she walked thousands of times, wearing a groove into the stone. We are going to examine the psychology of a woman who was forced to watch her own life rot away, while the man who imprisoned her rose to become the most powerful king in Europe. This is the story of how a princess became a ghost long before she died. To understand the severity of her punishment, we must first look at the map like a forensic geographer. Alden Castle was not a romantic fairy tale fortress perched on a mountaintop. It was a squat, timber frame manor house sitting in the middle of the Lüneburg Heath. The landscape around it was flat, desolate, and swampy. In the summer, it was plagued by mosquitoes. In the winter, it was a frozen wasteland of fog and mud. It was the geographic equivalent of depression. The castle was surrounded by a double moat, a physical manifestation of the paranoia of the House of Hanover. They weren't just keeping people out, they were keeping one specific person in. The security protocols established by George Louis were military in their precision. An entire company of infantry was stationed at the castle solely to guard her. The governor of the castle was bound by an oath on his life. If the Princess of Alden escaped, he would answer with his head. Imagine the daily visual reality for Sophia Dorothea. She was allowed to walk in the garden, but only under the eyes of guards. She was allowed to ride in a carriage, but there was a strict limit. She could travel exactly 2 miles from the castle gates, and then she had to turn back. This 2-mile leash is a detail of exquisite cruelty. It gave her the illusion of movement, the sensation of travel, but it always ended in the same place. For 32 years, she saw the same trees, the same bend in the river, the same horizon. It was a goldfish bowl designed for a human being. Despite the grim surroundings, Sophia Dorothea was still technically a duchess. The Hanoverians, in their strange obsession with protocol, allowed her a shadow court. She was given a generous allowance. She had ladies-in-waiting, cooks, servants, and a household staff. But this was not kindness. It was a gilded cage. The people surrounding her were not her friends. They were her jailers on the payroll. Every conversation she had was potentially reported back to Hanover. Every letter she wrote was opened, read, and censored. Sophia Dorothea responded to this surreal existence by engaging in a heartbreaking game of pretend. She decided that if she could not be a queen in London, she would be the Queen of Alden. She maintained a rigorous etiquette. She dressed in the finest French fashions, importing silks and lace from Paris, dressing up for dinners where no guests ever arrived. She invested in her court, expanding the gardens, redecorating the rooms, and buying silver plate. This behavior is fascinating from a psychological perspective. A weaker mind might have collapsed into squalor, refusing to bathe or dress. But Sophia Dorothea used luxury as a shield. By maintaining her appearance, by acting the part of the Grand Duchess, she was telling her ex-husband, "You can lock me up, but you cannot turn me into a peasant. I am still Sophia Dorothea of Celle." It was a rebellion of silk and diamonds, a defiance performed in front of a mirror because there was no one else to watch. For the first few years, Sophia Dorothea did not accept her fate. She believed, with the naive optimism of the innocent, that this was temporary. She thought it was a cooling-off period. She launched a relentless campaign of letters. She wrote to her father, the Duke of Celle. She wrote to her ex-husband, George Louis. She even wrote to the Electress Sophia, the mother-in-law who hated her. Reading these letters today is an exercise in agony. They are the sounds of a person banging on the inside of a coffin. She begged, she pleaded, she apologized for crimes she hadn't committed. She promised to be obedient, to be silent, to be anything they wanted, if only they would let her see her children. "I throw myself at your feet," she wrote to George. "I implore your mercy." But the response was silence. George Louis never answered, not once. He had a unique capacity for holding a grudge that bordered on the pathological. To him, she was dead. You don't write letters to the dead. Her father, influenced by the Hanoverians and ashamed of the scandal, also hardened his heart. He eventually stopped reading her letters altogether. The tragedy of the erased queen is that she wasn't erased by a single act of violence, but by thousands of acts of ignoring her. She was screaming into a void, and the void simply absorbed the sound. The timeline of her imprisonment contains 1 year of supreme irony, 1714. This was the year everything changed for the House of Hanover, and nothing changed for Sophia Dorothea. In 1714, Queen Anne of England died. According to the Act of Settlement, the crown passed to the nearest Protestant relative, Sophia's mother-in-law, Electress Sophia. But the Electress died just weeks before Queen Anne, so the crown passed to George Louis. Overnight, the boorish German Duke became King George I of Great Britain and Ireland. This meant that, technically, Sophia Dorothea was the Queen of England. If the divorce hadn't happened, if the imprisonment hadn't happened, she would have been packing her trunks for London. She would have been crowned in Westminster Abbey. She would have been the face on the coins. Instead, as cannons fired salutes in London and bells rang across the empire, Sophia Dorothea sat in her damp castle in the German marsh, listening to the rain. The elevation of her husband was the final nail in her coffin. Now that he was the King of England, he could not afford a scandal. He couldn't risk the mad wife showing up in London and reminding the British public about the murdered lover and the messy divorce. The security at Alden was tightened. The walls got higher. Her imprisonment was no longer just a punishment. It was a matter of British national security. She was the secret in the attic of the new royal dynasty. There is a dramatic incident from this period that highlights the sheer hopelessness of her situation. It is said that one night a fire broke out in the castle. In the chaos, there was a moment where the gates were open. The confusion offered a sliver of a chance for escape, but Sophia Dorothea didn't run. Why? Because she realized she had nowhere to go. Her father was dead. Her mother was living in retirement, powerless. Her children were in England, guarded by an army. If she ran, she would be hunted down like an animal. She realized that the prison wasn't just the stone walls. The prison was the world itself. There was no corner of Europe where George's influence, and now the power of the British Empire, could not reach her. She stood in the courtyard, watching the smoke rise, and then turned around and walked back to her room. That was the moment her spirit truly broke. The adventurer who had plotted with Königsmarck was gone. All that was left was the prisoner. While the isolation was painful, the true torture was the separation from her children. George Augustus and Sophia Dorothea the Younger were growing up. They were becoming adults, marrying and having children of their own. Sophia Dorothea missed everything. She missed her son's wedding. She missed the birth of her grandchildren. She missed her daughter becoming the queen in Prussia. She had to read about her own children in the newspapers. Imagine the psychological devastation of a mother who sees her son's face only on a commemorative coin. She tried to send gifts. She embroidered fine linens. She sent jewelry. George Louis intercepted them. He refused to let the children receive anything from the disgraced woman. He wanted to erase her memory from their minds. He told them their mother was a wicked, unstable woman who had abandoned them. But, and this is the detective twist that leads to future drama, the erasure didn't work. The forbidden nature of their mother made her a figure of fascination for the children, especially for George Augustus. He began to hate his father for what he had done. The Castle of Shadows was casting a long darkness that would eventually poison the relationship between the new king and his heir. Over the decades, a strange transformation took place. The weeping, pleading girl of the 1690s hardened into something else. In her 40s and 50s, Sophia Dorothea became bitter, cynical, and perhaps a little mad. She began to eat obsessively. The slender beauty became heavy and corpulent. Food was the only pleasure left to her, the only comfort that couldn't be taken away. She stopped writing begging letters and started writing curses. She spent her days staring at the portrait of George Louis, not with love, but with a hatred so pure it kept her alive. She became the Witch of Alden in the imagination of the locals. They saw her carriage pass by, the heavy curtains drawn, and they crossed themselves. They sensed the immense radioactive anger radiating from the vehicle. This transformation is a tragedy in itself. The system didn't just take her freedom, it took her personality. It took the light, French, joyful spirit of Sophia and crushed it until only a hard, dark diamond of hate remained. She became exactly what they accused her of being, a difficult, hardened woman. They created the monster they claimed to fear. Biologically, Sophia Dorothea was alive. Her heart beat, her lungs took in air, but sociologically she was a corpse. She had no legal standing, she had no voice, she had no future. She was a living ghost. This state of being is perhaps worse than physical death. In physical death there is rest. In social death, there is only the consciousness of what you are missing. She sat in her castle and watched the seasons change 32 times. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. She watched her hair turn gray. She watched her skin wrinkle. She watched her life evaporate like water in a saucer. And through it all, she held on to one singular burning hope, a dark hope. She hoped that George Louis would die first. If he died, her son would be king. And surely her son would release her. She was staying alive out of spite. She was engaging in a biological endurance race against her husband. She sat in the castle of shadows waiting for the news that the king was dead. But the irony of fate is cruel. The bizarre curse of her life had one final twist in store. She was the one who was running out of time. In the study of psychology, there's a concept known as the phantom limb. It is the sensation that an amputated arm or leg is still there, itching, aching, or burning, even though the physical flesh is gone. For the House of Hanover, Sophia Dorothea was a phantom limb. Though she was cut off from the family tree, cauterized by the divorce and buried in the silence of Alden Castle, her presence was felt every single day. She was the ghost at the banquet table. She was the whisper in the coronation hall. This chapter shifts the focus from the prisoner to the collateral damage, her children. George Augustus, the future king. George II was 11 years old when his mother vanished. Sophia Dorothea the Younger, the future Queen of Prussia, was 7. They were old enough to remember her warmth, but too young to understand her crime. This is the story of the stolen mother. It is an investigation into how the erasure of one woman poisoned the bloodline of the British monarchy for a century. It explains why the Hanoverian kings famously hated their own sons, starting a cycle of generational warfare that began with a boy crying for a mother who was never allowed to answer. The morning after Sophia Dorothea was taken away in 1694, a terrifying silence fell over the nursery in the Schloss. Children are observant detectives. They notice when the atmosphere changes. George and Sophia waited for their mother to come and kiss them good night. She didn't come. They asked the servants where she was. The servants, terrified of the elector's wrath, looked at the floor and mumbled lies. She has gone on a journey. She is resting. She is ill. But days turned into months and the journey never ended. The children were orphans with a living mother. The tragedy of this separation is that it was not a clean break like death. In death, there is a funeral, a grave, a process of grieving. Here, there was only a bewildering disappearance. The children sensed the tension. They heard the hushed whispers of the courtiers. They learned very quickly that speaking the name Mama was a dangerous act. It made their father's face turn purple with rage. It made their grandmother, the Electress Sophia, pursed her lips in disapproval. So the children learned to repress. They buried their love for their mother deep inside, just as their father had buried her lover under the floorboards. But repression is not erasure. The love curdled into confusion, and the confusion eventually hardened into a diamond-sharp hatred for the man responsible, their father, George Louis. The seeds of the famous Hanoverian feud, the historic hatred between George I and George II, were not sown in politics. They were sown in the nursery of a motherless boy. George Louis, now the sole parent, was a disaster of a father. He looked at his son, George Augustus, and he didn't see a child who needed comfort. He saw a reminder of the wife he despised. He looked for the detective clues of infidelity. Did the boy have Königsmarck's nose? Did he have Sophia's rebellious temper? Every time George Augustus acted out, displaying the fiery emotion of his mother, George Louis punished him. He treated his son not as an heir, but as a rival. The upbringing of the children was handed over to the grandmother, Electress Sophia. She was a brilliant intellectual, a correspondent of philosophers, but she was emotionally glacial. She raised them with logic, duty, and stoicism. She tried to scrub the French influence of their mother out of their souls. They were taught to be German, to be rational, to be obedient. But genetics is a stubborn thing. George Augustus grew up to be short, choleric, and passionate, exactly like the mix of his parents. The visual of their childhood is one of cold splendor. They lived in palaces filled with gold and tapestries, but they were emotionally starving. They watched their father parade his mistress, Melusine von der Schulenburg, around the court. They saw Melusine's children, their illegitimate half-siblings, treated with more affection than they were. This injustice burned into the young George Augustus's soul. He began to view the mistress as the wicked stepmother of the fairy tale, the usurper who had stolen his mother's place. As the children entered adolescence, the secret of their mother became a legend they tried to decode. They couldn't visit her. They couldn't write to her, but they found ways to keep her alive. There is a touching historical anecdote about a hidden portrait. It is said that George Augustus found a painting of his mother, one of the few that hadn't been destroyed or turned to face the wall. He hid it in his closet. Imagine the future King of England, a teenage boy, sneaking into his closet at night to look at the face of the woman in the stone castle. He would study her features, trying to find himself in them. This secret worship created a martyr complex around Sophia Dorothea. To her children, she wasn't the adulteress who risked the dynasty. She was the innocent victim, the saint suffering in purgatory. They idealized her. Because she wasn't there to scold them or disappoint them, she became perfect. This idealization made the reality of their father seem even more monstrous. Every time George Louis was cruel, George Augustus would think Mama wouldn't be like this. Mama would understand. The prisoner in Alden became the silent third party in every argument between father and son. By 1714, when the family moved to London to take the British throne, the tension exploded. George Augustus was now the Prince of Wales. He was 31 years old, a grown man with a wife and children of his own. The move to England gave him a new stage for his rebellion. The British people, who hated the sour, German-speaking King George I, loved the younger, more vibrant Prince of Wales. George Augustus used this popularity as a weapon. He set up a rival court at Leicester House. He undermined his father's ministers. He flirted with the opposition. But the core of the conflict remained the stolen mother. At court events, George Augustus would go out of his way to humiliate his father's mistresses. He refused to show them respect. He treated them as whores. This wasn't just moral posturing. It was a defense of his mother's honor. Every insult he threw at Melusine was a flower he was laying at the feet of Sophia Dorothea. The king retaliated with brutal force. He arrested his son. He kicked him out of St. James's Palace. He even seized his grandchildren and refused to let the parents see them, a cruel echo of what he had done to Sophia Dorothea. He was reenacting the trauma, proving that the cycle of abuse was unbroken. While the son fought a public war, the daughter, Sophia Dorothea the Younger, fought a private one. In 1706, she was married off to her cousin, Frederick William of Prussia. If she hoped to escape the misery of Hanover, she was mistaken. She married into the House of Hohenzollern, and her husband became known as the Soldier King. Frederick William was a violent, abusive tyrant who despised culture and loved only tall soldiers. The younger, Sophia Dorothea, found herself in a marriage that mirrored her mother's. She was refined, artistic, and intelligent. Her husband was a brute who hit her and their children. But here is the philosophy of resilience. Unlike her mother, the younger Sophia did not rebel. She did not take a lover. She did not run away. She had learned the lesson of Alden. She saw the ghost of her mother standing over her, warning her, "Don't do it. The price is too high." Instead, she channeled her energy into her son Frederick. She poured all her love, her culture, her French sensibilities into him. Her husband hated the boy for being soft and beat him mercilessly, but the mother protected him. That boy grew up to be Frederick the Great, the greatest king Prussia ever had, a warrior philosopher who changed Europe. So, in a strange, twisted way, the prisoner of Alden shaped the future of Germany. Her spirit leaped over a generation. The artistic soul that George Louis tried to crush in his wife bloomed spectacularly in her grandson. There is a persistent legend that haunts this period, the legend of the rescue attempt. It is whispered that George Augustus, as Prince of Wales, plotted to break his mother out of Alden. The detective evidence for this is scant, mostly rumors and diplomatic gossip, but it speaks to the emotional truth. It is said that secret agents were sent to survey the moat. There were plans to bribe the guards. Why didn't it happen? Perhaps because Sophia Dorothea refused. By this time, she was older, heavier, and institutionalized. She might have feared that an escape attempt would lead to her son's disinheritance or even a civil war, or perhaps the risk was simply too high. George I had spies everywhere. If the Prince of Wales was caught kidnapping a state prisoner, it would be treason. But the most tragic aspect is the promise. It was widely believed that George Augustus vowed that the moment his father died, his first act as king would be to release his mother. He held on to this fantasy for decades. "When I am king, I will bring her to London. I will give her the title of Queen Mother. I will make them all bow to her." He was living for the future. She was dying in the present. This gap in time is the tragedy. He was waiting for a death that took too long to come. As we analyze the impact of the stolen mother, we see that the House of Hanover became a dynasty built on a wound. Because George I erased his wife, he erased the emotional core of the family. He created a precedent. Fathers hate sons. George I hated George II. George II hated his son Frederick, Prince of Wales. Frederick hated his son George III. It became a hereditary curse. Why? Psychologists suggest that without the mediating influence of a mother, the father-son relationship becomes pure competition. It becomes a struggle for dominance between two alpha males. Sophia Dorothea was the missing link. She was the softness that should have buffered the hardness. Without her, the family was just iron striking iron, creating sparks and noise but no warmth. The erasure of Sophia also created a deep misogyny in the Hanoverian line. The kings learned to view intelligent, independent women as threats. They preferred docile mistresses to equal partners. They married women they could control, or they ignored their wives entirely. The shadow of Alden fell over every royal marriage for the next 100 years. As the 1720s dragged on, the situation became a race against mortality. In London, George Augustus was praying for his father to die. In Alden, Sophia Dorothea was praying for her husband to die. In Berlin, the younger Sophia was praying for her father to die. It was a family united by a single dark wish, the death of the patriarch. But George I was tough. He was a survivor. He marched on, seemingly indestructible, fueled by duty and stubbornness. Meanwhile, in the Castle of Shadows, Sophia Dorothea's health began to fail. The long years of lack of exercise, the rich food she ate for comfort, and the crushing depression took their toll. She began to realize the terrifying truth. She was not going to win the race. She was going to die a prisoner. The rescue was never coming. The carriage to London would never arrive. The realization must have been shattering. But as her body failed, her anger distilled into something potent. She had one weapon left, a weapon she could only use from the grave. She began to write her final letter. Not a love letter this time, a death warrant. There is an old saying that revenge is a dish best served cold. But in the case of Sophia Dorothea, revenge was a dish served from beyond the grave. For 32 years, she had been the passive victim. She had taken the blows, the silence, and the imprisonment. She had watched her life evaporate within the damp walls of Alden Castle, while her husband, King George I, ruled the British Empire. But in the winter of 1726, as she lay dying, the prisoner decided to strike back. She didn't use an army, for she had none. She didn't use a sword, for she was weak. She used the only weapon left to her, a piece of paper and a pen. This chapter investigates the legend of the deathbed letter. It is the story of a curse so potent, so psychologically devastating, that many historians believe it literally frightened a king to death. We are about to witness the final confrontation between the jailer and the captive. It is a duel where one participant is a corpse and the other is a king fleeing for his life across the plains of Germany, pursued by a shadow he thought he had buried forever. By November 1726, the Castle of Shadows had finally done its work. Sophia Dorothea was 60 years old. She was no longer the vibrant, dark-eyed beauty who had danced with Count Königsmarck. She was heavy, plagued by digestive issues, depressed and tired. The long war of attrition was over. Her body was shutting down. For decades she had sustained herself with the dark hope that she would outlive George. She had exercised, she had eaten, she had waited. But as the winter fogs rolled in over the Lüneburg Heath, she realized the bitter truth. She had lost the race. George I was still healthy, still traveling between London and Hanover, still powerful. She was going to die a prisoner. The realization must have been a moment of existential horror. To spend half your life in a box waiting for a door to open, only to die before the key turns. It is the ultimate definition of a wasted life. But as the end approached, Sophia Dorothea's despair turned into a cold, diamond-hard clarity. She stopped fearing George. What could he do to her now? Kill her? She was already dying. Imprison her? She was leaving the prison. For the first time since 1694, she was free. And she decided to use that freedom to deliver one final message. The scene in the death chamber of Alden on November 13, 1726, is one of the most dramatic in royal history. Sophia Dorothea lay in her bed, surrounded by her shadow court, the ladies and servants who had grown old with her. She knew the end was hours away. A pastor was brought in to give her the last rites, but Sophia Dorothea refused to accept the communion in silence. According to the accounts, she sat up. She looked the pastor in the eye, and she made a final declaration. She swore on her salvation, on the brink of eternity, that she had never committed adultery with Count Königsmarck. "I am innocent," she declared, "and I summon my husband, King George, to meet me before the judgment seat of God to answer for the wrongs he has done me." Whether this declaration of innocence was the truth or a final act of defiance is a matter for the philosopher to debate. But the detective is interested in what she wrote. It is said that in those final days she dictated a letter. It was not a petition for mercy. It was a summons. The curse letter was addressed directly to the King of England. In it, she catalogued every cruelty he had inflicted upon her: the neglect, the mistress, the murder of Königsmarck, the separation from her children, the 32 years of stone walls. and she ended it with a prophecy. She summoned him to meet her at the divine tribunal within a year and a day. "I will wait for you," the letter effectively said. "You have judged me on earth, but God will judge you in heaven, and I will be the witness for the prosecution." She entrusted this letter to a loyal courtier with strict instructions. It must be placed in the king's hands the moment she was dead. Sophia Dorothea died on November 13th, 1726. The news traveled slowly in the 18th century. It took days for the couriers to reach London. When King George I received the news, his reaction was chilling. He was playing cards or attending to state business. He didn't weep, he didn't pause. He simply nodded and continued. He immediately issued orders to suppress the event. There was to be no mourning at the British court, no black armbands, no bells tolling. The London Gazette, the official newspaper, was forbidden to print her obituary. To the king, this wasn't the death of a queen, it was the disposal of a problem. He wanted her to vanish as completely in death as she had in life, but he couldn't control everything. His son, the Prince of Wales, heard the news. The stolen mother was dead. The reunion he had dreamed of for 30 years would never happen. The prince was devastated, but his grief quickly turned to fury. In a defiant act of rebellion, the prince and his wife, Caroline, draped their court at Leicester House in purple mourning robes. It was a public visual war. The king's court was in bright colors. The prince's court was in black. London watched the drama unfold. The people who hated the king sided with the prince. The ghost of Sophia Dorothea was already causing chaos in the capital, just days after her death. Meanwhile, back in Germany, there was a grotesque problem. What to do with the body? George III sent orders that she was not to be buried in the royal crypt at Celle with her parents. He didn't want her honored. He ordered that she be buried in the garden of Alden Castle, like a commoner, or perhaps in a nameless grave. But the ground was frozen solid. The grave diggers couldn't dig, and the locals were superstitious. They whispered that the earth refused to accept her because she hadn't been given justice. So her coffin was placed in a cellar in the castle. It sat there for months. An unburied queen, a restless spirit. This detail is crucial for the tragedy. Even in death, she was kept in limbo, waiting for her husband's permission to rest. It was a final petty act of control by a man who couldn't let go of his hatred. June 1727, 7 months after Sophia Dorothea's death. King George I decided to leave England for the summer. He wanted to visit his beloved Hanover. He was 67 years old. He was healthy, robust, and seemingly indestructible. He had survived wars, rebellions, and the Jacobite plots. But his courtiers noticed a change in him. George I was a rational man, but he was also a man of his time, superstitious. The rumor of the deathbed letter had reached him. Some say the letter was delivered to him in London. Others say it was waiting for him in Germany. But the prophecy was in his mind within a year and a day. It had been 7 months. The clock was ticking. He set off for Germany in good spirits, but there was a shadow over the procession. He traveled by carriage, crossing the Channel, then riding through the flatlands of Holland and Germany. He was heading toward Osnabrück, the city where he was born. It was a journey home, but it would become a journey to the grave. The detective must now sift through the legends to find the truth of what happened on the road near Osnabrück on June 11th, 1727. The most persistent historical account, the one that fits the psychological profile, is that the curse letter finally caught up with him. As his carriage rattled along the dusty road, a courier rode up, or perhaps someone threw a packet into the window. The king opened it. It was the letter from Sophia Dorothea. He read the summons. "I summon you to the tribunal of God." Imagine the psychological impact. This was a man who had successfully ignored his wife for 3 decades. He had buried her under layers of stone in silence. But here she was, speaking to him from the dead. The guilt he had suppressed, the fear he had hidden, the realization of his own mortality, it all slammed into him at once. This is the philosophy of psychosomatic death. The mind kills the body. The shock was physical. The king slumped forward. His face went purple. His eyes rolled back. He had suffered a massive stroke. His courtiers panicked. They shouted at the driver to go faster. To Osnabrück, to the bishop's palace. The king was paralyzed, gasping for air. In his delirium, it is said he muttered, "It is all over with me." Did he see her ghost? Did he see the White Lady of the Hohenzollerns? Or did he just see the emptiness of his own soul reflecting back at him? The carriage raced into the courtyard of the bishop's palace in Osnabrück. This location is the final, supreme irony of the story. Osnabrück was where George was born in 1660. He was dying in the exact same room where he had entered the world. The circle was closing perfectly. His brother, the prince bishop, came rushing out, but it was too late. In the early hours of June 11th, 1727, King George I died. Let us check the calendar. Sophia Dorothea died in November 1726. George I died in June 1727. 7 months. The prophecy held true. He died within a year and a day. The prisoner had executed the jailer. A coroner would say no. He died of a stroke caused by age, diet, and travel stress. But a tragedian would say yes. She killed him with stress. She killed him with guilt. She killed him with the power of suggestion. George I was a man of absolute control. He controlled his kingdom, his army, his family, but he couldn't control the narrative of his wife. Her final act of defiance, the letter, pierced his armor in a way no sword could. It reminded him that there was a higher court than the one he presided over. There is a terrifying symmetry to their deaths. She died alone in a German castle, longing to be free. He died in a German palace, longing to live. They were bound together by hatred just as tightly as any lovers are bound by romance. They were the twin poles of a magnetic field of misery. And when one pole collapsed, the other had to follow. The king was dead. The tyrant was gone. The news raced back to London. The courier knelt before George Augustus and said, "The king is dead. Long live the king." George II was finally the master. The first thing he did, he didn't weep for his father. He thought of his mother. The stolen mother had finally been avenged. Now the new king had a promise to keep. He had vowed to bring her home. But as we will see in the final chapter, even the power of a king has limits when facing the inertia of history. In ancient Rome, when an emperor committed crimes so heinous that the state wanted to destroy him, they issued a decree called Damnatio Memoriae, the damnation of memory. Their statues were smashed, their names were chiseled off stone tablets, and their faces were scrubbed from coins. The goal was to make it so that the person had never existed. King George I of England tried to inflict this Roman punishment on his wife, Sophia Dorothea. He locked her in a box for 32 years. He forbade her name. He burned her letters. He tried to turn her into a mist that would evaporate with the morning sun. But history has a strange way of resisting erasure. You can burn paper, but you cannot burn DNA. You can lock up a body, but you cannot lock up a legacy. When the news of George I's death reached London in June 1727, his son, the new King George II, faced a profound psychological crisis. For 33 years, George II had worshipped the memory of his stolen mother. He had kept her portrait hidden in his closet like a sacred relic. He had hated his father with a biblical intensity for what he had done to her. Now, he was the king. He possessed absolute power. The moment he had dreamed of since he was a frightened 11-year-old boy had finally arrived. He could bring her home. But here is the tragedy of power. It is a trap. George II wanted to rehabilitate his mother. He wanted to declare her innocent. He wanted to bring her body to Westminster Abbey and bury her as a queen. But his ministers sat him down and explained the brutal political reality. If he declared Sophia Dorothea innocent, he would have to explain why she was imprisoned. He would have to open the archives of the silent trial. If he opened the trial, the world would learn about Count Königsmarck. They would learn about the adultery. And if the world accepted that Sophia Dorothea was an adulteress, then George II's own legitimacy would be questioned. His enemies, the Jacobites, would scream that the King of England was not the son of George I, but the bastard son of a Swedish adventurer. George II realized with a sinking heart that he was trapped by his father's lies. To save his crown, he had to maintain the silence. He had to become an accomplice to the very crime he hated. The erased queen had to remain erased for the sake of the dynasty. It was a betrayal that must have eaten at his soul. He couldn't give her a state funeral. He couldn't give her the title of Queen Mother. The system had won again. However, George II could do one thing. He could rescue her body from the humiliation of the Alden cellar. His father had left her coffin rotting in a storage room unburied, refusing to let her rest with her ancestors. George II issued secret orders. In the dead of night, so as not to arouse public attention or political scandal, a hearse arrived at Alden Castle. The heavy coffin of Sophia Dorothea was loaded onto it. For the first time in 33 years, she crossed the moat. She passed the gates that had been locked since 1695. She was finally leaving prison. The procession traveled across the Lüneburg Heath to the town of Celle, her childhood home, the place where she had been happy before the sale of her life. She was taken to the Stadtkirche Saint-Marien. There, in the crypt of the Dukes of Celle, she was laid to rest beside her parents. There was no grand ceremony. There were no weeping crowds. It was a private, stealthy burial. But it was a victory. She was home. She was no longer the property of the Hanoverians. She was the daughter of Celle again. If you visit the crypt today, you can see her ornate sarcophagus. It lies there in the quiet dark, far away from the husband who hated her, reunited with the father who sold her and the mother who mourned her. George III had tried to crush Sophia Dorothea's spirit. He hated her French nature, her emotion, her love of art, her sharp tongue, her defiance. He wanted his descendants to be rigid, disciplined, unemotional Germans. But biology is the ultimate rebel. Sophia Dorothea's DNA was potent. It skipped a generation and exploded in her grandchildren. Let us look at Frederick the Great of Prussia. Frederick was the son of Sophia's daughter. His father, the soldier king, was a brute who hated art and loved war. He beat Frederick, abused him, and tried to break his spirit exactly as George I had done to his wife. But Frederick was Sophia Dorothea reborn. He loved the flute. He wrote poetry in French. He corresponded with Voltaire. He was sensitive, artistic, and brilliant. The grandfather tried to stamp out that weakness, but the grandson took that weakness and turned it into genius. Frederick became the greatest monarch of the 18th century, a philosopher king who reshaped Europe. Every time Frederick played his flute, every time he wrote a witty letter, he was channeling the ghost of the grandmother he never met. It was the ultimate revenge. The French frivolity that George I despised became the crowning glory of the age. The legacy goes further. Sophia Dorothea is the ancestor of every major royal house in Europe. Through her son, George II, she is the ancestor of the British royal family. Through her daughter, she is the ancestor of the Prussian/German imperial family and the Greek royal family. Through other lines, her blood flows in the veins of the Spanish, Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian royals. This is the philosophy of the resurrection. George I tried to make her a non-person. He wanted her to be a footnote. Instead, she became the mitochondrial Eve of modern royalty. You cannot look at a picture of Queen Victoria without seeing the eyes of Sophia Dorothea. You cannot look at the history of Europe without seeing her influence. The woman in the stone box ended up colonizing the entire continent with her blood. The jailer, George I, is remembered largely as a footnote, the first Hanoverian, a grumpy man who didn't speak English. But Sophia Dorothea is the matriarch. In the long game of evolution, the prisoner won. However, the victory was not without a price. The trauma of Sophia Dorothea's erasure left a scar on the House of Hanover that refused to heal. We spoke in previous chapters about the Hanoverian feud, the hatred between fathers and sons. This feud didn't end with George II. George II, the boy who cried for his stolen mother, grew up to be a difficult father. He hated his own son, Frederick, Prince of Wales. When Frederick died prematurely, George II reportedly said, "I am glad." Why? Why was there so much poison in this family? Psychologists would point to the original trauma. The family was founded on a secret, the imprisonment of the mother and the murder of the lover. George II was raised in a house of lies. He learned that love is dangerous, that fathers are tyrants, and that families are battlegrounds. He passed this dysfunction down to his children, who passed it to theirs. The screaming matches, the public humiliations, the expulsions from court, it was all an echo of the violence of 1694. The ghost of Alden didn't haunt the castle. She haunted the relationships. She was the silence between the words, the coldness in the embrace. The Hanoverians became the most powerful dynasty in the world, but they were also the most dysfunctional, forever breaking the hearts of their own children, just as George I had broken theirs. For centuries, the Hanoverian version of history prevailed. Sophia Dorothea was the bad wife. Königsmark was the villain. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, the detective work of historians began to dismantle the lie. The letters, the Königsmark correspondence, were found. They had been hidden in Sweden by the Königsmark family. When they were published, the world finally heard Sophia Dorothea's voice. They didn't read the confession of a criminal. They read the desperate cries of a woman in love. They read about her loneliness, her fear, her passion. The silent trial was finally overturned in the court of public opinion. We saw her not as a traitor, but as a tragic heroine. This is the final stage of her resurrection. She reclaimed her narrative. She stopped being the object of the story and became the subject. So who killed whom? George I killed Sophia Dorothea socially. He stole 32 years of her life. He turned a vibrant woman into a shadow. But Sophia Dorothea killed George I's reputation. Today, nobody visits the grave of George I in Hanover to pay respects. He is a historical abstraction. But people still visit Celle. They still write books about Sophia. They still make movies about her. Her suffering gave her immortality. Tragedy has a way of preserving people in amber. By locking her away, George I accidentally preserved her legend. If she had lived a normal life, divorced, remarried, grown old in obscurity, she might have been forgotten. But as the prisoner of Alden, she became a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Let us end this series with a final visual. Imagine the crypt in Celle today. It is cool and quiet. In the center lies the ornate silver casket of Sophia Dorothea. Next to her lies her father, the Duke who sold her. Nearby is her mother, the Duchess who loved her. But George the First is far away. She is finally safe from him. The moat is gone. The guards are gone. The spies are gone. She lies there, the queen who never wore a crown, but who conquered history. And somewhere, under the floorboards of a renovated Parliament building in Hanover, lie the scattered bones of Philip Christoph von Königsmarck. They are separated by miles of earth, but in the story of the world, they are buried together. The love affair that destroyed a kingdom is now just dust and ink, but the lesson remains. You can erase a name from a prayer book. You can erase a body from a room, but you cannot erase the truth. It will always claw its way out from under the floorboards. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the complete, terrifying, and heartbreaking story of Sophia Dorothea of Celle, the erased queen. We have traveled from the glittering ballrooms of the 17th century to the dark cellars of Alden. We have seen murder, betrayal, and a love so reckless it burned down a dynasty. Her life forces us to ask, what is the price of freedom? Sophia paid 32 years of her life for a few months of love. Was it worth it? Would she do it again? I think if she could speak to us from the crypt, she would say, at least for a moment, I was alive. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darkest secret of the British royal family, please leave a like. It helps the algorithm find these lost stories. And tell me in the comments, do you think George the First deserved his fate? Or was he just a product of his brutal time? Thank you for watching the story of the erased queen. I'll see you in the next tragedy.